Lucilla stood in front of the mirror, unable to tear her gaze away from her own reflection. On this day, it seemed like nothing could spoil her happiness. Before her stood a young woman in a magnificent wedding dress, one that looked as if it were crafted from clouds. It was adorned with lace and pearlescent beads, sparkling in the rays of the morning sun like dewdrops on spring grass. The veil, light and airy, gently fluttered in the wind, adding an enchanting sense of delicacy to her appearance. Lucilla, eyes wide in awe, marveled at how her chestnut hair, soft as silk, fell in gentle waves over her shoulders. The delicate pearl-embroidered shoes shimmered, casting mysterious glints of light onto the light wood floor. This was the moment she had dreamed of her entire life. The room was silent, with only the sound of her heartbeat, pounding so fast it felt like it might leap out of her chest, breaking the stillness. Lucilla glanced at herself one more time, as if trying to etch this moment into her memory forever. The moment when she was ready to step into a new, perhaps the most important chapter of her life. Her heart tightened as she thought about it. Today was her day. The day she would marry James, the man she had shared her dreams and worries with. The man she loved so much, it seemed nothing could ever tear them apart. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, and she quickly wiped them away, raising her chin with pride. On the porch of her house stood her elderly neighbor, the only person Lucilla kept in touch with. She was quiet and lonely, having devoted her life to helping others, without expecting anything in return. The old woman couldn't help but notice the glow in the young woman's eyes, and her heart filled with warmth. She approached Lucilla and bowed to her with respect, as if she were not just a bride, but a princess, an embodiment of purity and love. "God bless you, dear," the neighbor said, crossing her chest as if offering her protection and support. "May your life be as beautiful as you look in this dress." Lucilla, feeling the heartfelt warmth in her words, smiled and thanked the old woman. A moment later, she found herself in the limousine, holding a small bouquet, her heart full of hope, beginning its journey toward the registry office. The car smoothly glided through the suburbs, silently passing by homes, gardens, and parks she had known since childhood. Lucilla gazed out the window, unable to stop thinking about James and how she had waited so eagerly for this day. But there was something strange in the air. Her usual sense of confidence began to fade, like a cloud blocking the sun. Maybe it was because everything seemed too perfect, like something out of a fairy tale. She tried not to think about the strange feeling growing in her chest, but it only became stronger. When the limousine pulled up to the square and stopped near the registry office, she felt her heart tighten sharply. This place wasn't what she had imagined. Everything was quiet, too quiet, and somewhere deep in her soul, something stirred uneasily. She saw him. James. He stood there, at a distance, motionless, dressed in a tracksuit and light sneakers, as if he didn't notice what was happening around him. It seemed as though he wasn't a part of this day, not a part of her life. He looked at her but didn't take a step toward her. His gaze was cold and distant, and it hit Lucilla like a blow. Struggling to understand what was happening, she slowly climbed out of the car, trying to find words, but inside everything felt eerily empty. She looked at him, unable to believe what was happening. Where was the love that was supposed to be waiting for her ahead? Where was the hand that was meant to meet hers and comfort her? Instead, she saw emptiness. Pain and confusion filled her chest. There was no excitement, no joy. Only a cold silence. Lucilla didn't even have time to shout before the driver casually rolled up the window, shutting her off from the world. The glass scraped as it rose, and she was left alone, with that strange feeling of uncertainty and disappointment tightening around her heart. She tried pounding on the glass with her fists, desperately begging the driver to stop the car, but nothing helped. The limousine smoothly started moving again, carrying her further away from what she had once thought was her happiness. A heavy shadow hung in the air, as if fate itself had turned away from her. And in that moment, Lucilla understood. Her life was perhaps just beginning. But what would come next remained a mystery. The car kept moving, carrying Lucilla farther and farther from the city, from the place where her life had seemed perfect just hours ago, and her future, without a cloud in the sky. Time stretched on painfully, like thick molasses, and her heart squeezed with fear. The limousine rolled down the lifeless streets, and all she could hear was the ticking of the clock and her own breathing, shallow and uneven. She tried to make sense of what was happening, but her mind was in chaos. It felt like she was trapped in a nightmare where everything around her was blurry and alien. Why hadn't James shown up at the registry office? Why wasn't he there on the most important day of her life? Could this all just be a bad dream? She stared out the window in shock, but all she could see was the same miserable scene. Rain, muddy roads, gray houses, empty fields. Everything felt cold and foreign. Despair slowly turned into anger. Lucilla clenched her fists and, turning to the driver, screamed in horror. "What's going on? Where is he? Why didn't you stop? Take me back." But the driver said nothing. He sat in the shadow, barely noticeable in the dark, glancing in the rearview mirror every now and then, silently, as if her screams were nothing more than a puff of winter air. Lucilla was ready to explode with rage, but instead, a sense of hopelessness crept into her voice. "Why are you silent? Why aren't you saying anything?" In response, silence. He didn't look at her, didn't react. His eyes were empty, his whole being seemed detached, as if he were a part of the car and not a living person. There was neither aggression nor sympathy, just cold, lifeless silence. With each mile, her panic grew, a storm tightening around her chest. The limousine continued, veering off the paved roads and onto a narrow, winding dirt path that led deep into the forest. The car slid over the uneven ground and Lucilla felt her heart race. Every bump, every rough turn made her feel like she was drifting farther away from everything familiar and safe, falling into an unknown, frightening shadow. "Where are we? Where are you taking me?" Her voice now sounded pleading, but the driver remained deaf to her requests. Couldn't he hear her? Or was he just ignoring her, as part of this dark and unclear plan? Finally, the limousine slowed and stopped in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees whose branches creaked in the wind. In the forest's darkness, there were no sounds, no signs of life. Just a heavy silence that felt ominous. Lucilla couldn't make sense of what was happening and why her life, which had seemed like a fairy tale just moments ago, had turned into something terrifying and alien. The driver didn't turn to her, but opened the door, silently gesturing for her to get out. It was as if he hadn't expected resistance, as though it had been predetermined. "Why?" Lucilla whispered, unable to hold back her tears, but her words dissolved in the night air, never reaching his heart. Without acknowledging her question, he spoke with an empty expression. "I'm following your fiancé's orders." A sharp pain gripped her chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing her heart. Orders? The word spun in her mind, and she couldn't believe it. Where was James? Why wasn't he here? Why was she in this eerie, desolate place? The driver took out a mobile phone, its screen glowing brightly in the darkness. He spoke briefly, and Lucilla could only make out a few words. "It's done. Waiting for the night. I'll be back later." Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and, without another word, handed her a jacket. It felt strange. She couldn't understand why he was leaving her here, in this forgotten patch of forest, in the dark, with this jacket, as if everything had already been decided. Like her role in this strange play had already ended. Lucilla took the jacket, feeling its weight in her hands, but couldn't stop herself from glancing at him once more. "Wait," she weakly said. "You can't just leave. You can't leave me here." But the driver was already almost at the door, not paying attention to her words. He didn't stop, didn't say a word of comfort. His footsteps faded into the night silence, and soon he disappeared into the forest like a shadow, dissolving into the darkness. Lucilla stood there, completely alone. She felt the cold seep into her through the dress, through her skin. The wind tore at her veil, and the dark trees surrounding her seemed alive, as though they were watching her. What had happened? What did "it's done" mean? And where was James? Why hadn't he shown up? There were no answers, only the unsettling silence, growing deeper and more haunting with every passing moment. Alone, vulnerable, Lucilla stood in that empty clearing, surrounded by darkness that, with each moment, felt more menacing. Lucilla sat on the cold, damp ground, surrounded by the dark forest. She tried to find her way, but all she could see was darkness. The forest, like a vast trap, had enclosed her in its unreachable, shadowy embrace. Panic slowly grew in her chest, tightening around her heart like iron claws. With every step, the forest seemed more ominous, and every turn in the path led nowhere. She found herself back where she started. It was as if nature itself didn't want to let her go. The trees stood like sentinels, and in their twisting branches, Lucilla felt something foreign and hostile. Her feet sank into the soft earth, and she tried to follow the barely discernible tracks left by the car's tires, but they led nowhere, into a swamp hidden among the trees. The ground beneath her feet grew thicker, and with each step, she sank deeper into the mud. Her head spun with exhaustion, her body drained, and her thoughts were a jumbled mess. Her hands, covered in dirt and leaves, slipped helplessly over the wet branches. She could feel her breath growing more and more shallow. Her chest tightened, and a lump in her throat made it hard to breathe. The fog hung thick around her, growing denser, as if the forest was becoming even more suffocating, filling the space with its oppressive shadow. Sitting on a fallen log near the swamp, Lucilla felt the cold creep into her bones, and tears welled up in her eyes. Despair overtook her. All she could do was sit, lost in hopeless, futile thoughts. How had she ended up in this nightmare? Why had they left her here, alone in this forest? Why had everything around her become so alien? Suddenly, as her thoughts turned cloudy and painful, she heard a strange sound that made her heart freeze in her chest. It was faint but distinct, like the very earth beneath her had sighed. This wasn't the usual sound of nature she was used to hearing in the woods. This was something else, something alive. Lucilla lifted her head, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness, just the fog and the black silhouettes of the trees. But the sound came again. It was coming from the ground beneath her feet. This wasn't the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. The earth itself seemed to be alive. She could hear something moving under her. Before she could react, Lucilla felt the ground right in front of her start to rise slowly. A clump of dirt and muck gave off strange, unsettling noises, as though something massive and heavy was trying to push its way out. At first, it was just an unclear movement, but slowly the mound began to stretch upward, as if something beneath was pulling itself out of the earth. She could see the surface of the clump covered with a sticky layer of slime, and deep within her, an instinctive sense of danger flared up, an unexplainable feeling that screamed at her to run. Slowly, very slowly, the mound began to take shape. It became firmer, more defined. At first, it was just a vague outline. But soon, Lucilla could make out the figure of a human-like shape, draped in darkness that seemed to be part of the forest itself. The figure was tall with distorted proportions, as if its body had not been made by nature. But it wasn't a monster. No, this was something far stranger and more terrifying. The creature, covered in dark, nearly black skin, stood in front of her. It didn't move, but Lucilla couldn't tear her eyes away. It was perfectly still, but everything about it radiated movement, as though its very essence was locked in some terrible tension. The creature stared at her, its eyes glowing with a strange amber light like fire consuming the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. Her whole body tightened with terror. She knew she should run, but her body refused to move. She couldn't look away from those eyes, which watched her with an unsettling curiosity. The creature wasn't evil. It was alien. It wasn't human nor animal. It was something more, a thing that had come here to watch. It was studying her, waiting for the right moment. Every attempt to move felt futile. Her legs wouldn't lift. The creature didn't move, but its presence filled the space around her, consumed her consciousness. Lucilla could feel her body begin to tremble, and her mind slowly losing its focus. She knew if she couldn't move, if she couldn't escape, that creature would take her. It would consume her in this forest. Earlier, when she sat on the log, it had seemed like just an ordinary forest, but now she could feel it. The forest was breathing. The forest was alive. Its dark roots were stretching toward her. Its shadows crept over her skin. Everything around her was alive. Everything was part of something far older, far more terrifying. And then she understood. The creature was part of the forest. It was its guardian, its soul. And she, like all those who dared to step into its darkness, had become its prey. The creature took its first step. It was quick, almost imperceptible, and with each movement, with every second, the forest grew denser. Its shadows stretched longer. Lucilla jumped to her feet, but it was too late. The creature was too close, and she knew she had no chance. The forest had already swallowed her. Lucilla stood, holding her breath. The creature before her wasn't just a monster. It was something more, something beyond a mere terrifying figure covered in moss and dirt. She felt a strange connection to it, as if it were a part of her, as though her own soul was responding to its presence. Fear burned inside her. Yet deep down, she knew this wasn't by chance. There was something so familiar about it, something that made cold sweat bead on her forehead. Her wide eyes, filled with horror, tried to make out the details of the figure standing before her. The creature was tall, its body twisted as though it had been pieced together from parts that were never meant to be one. Its face, covered in slime and moss, was distorted by time and terror. But in its features, Lucilla saw something strangely familiar. Deep wrinkles in its skin, like the marks of long exposure to water or earth, couldn't hide the expression of pain, loss, and some long-forgotten sorrow. Unable to hold back, she took a step forward. The voice that escaped her throat was weak but desperate. "Who are you?" The answer came, but it wasn't just the voice of a monster. It was something that pierced her to her very core. The voice was familiar, like a distant echo from her childhood, a soft whisper that had long vanished from her life. This voice belonged to her parents, but it was distorted, mixed with ancient pain, superstition, and a lingering ache that could only be described as an apology, almost forgotten, but still bitter. You weren't supposed to come here, Lucilla," the voice said, but it sounded like an echo. We stayed here so you would come. We led you to this moment." Lucilla felt her body tense, her legs barely holding her up. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she knew she could no longer believe what she had once known. It was too strange. Everything in her life now seemed like a lie. Her parents, who had disappeared so many years ago, vanished when she was just a child. It all made sense now, and all of it had led her here, to this forest, to this trap she could never understand. "What do you want from me?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, and she felt pain rising in her chest, as though the earth itself were squeezing her heart. The creature stepped closer, and Lucilla felt heart pound in her chest. She couldn't understand what it was doing, but it wasn't moving toward her forcefully. Its approach was like something inevitable, like the steps of fate, ones you could never escape. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her thoughts begin to spiral. "You're part of us, Lucilla. We're all here. We've always been here. We became this. The forest, it consumed us, and now you're with us. You're part of the forest, part of us. You've come home." The words rang like a dreadful revelation, and Lucilla felt her mind begin to crack under their weight. The forest. The forest that took her parents. The forest that was the source of their disappearance was now her fate. It had consumed them, and now she was part of this living, reaching space, this merciless, ancient entity. The forest had always been with her, even when she hadn't known it. It had been calling to her all along, in this moment, when her heart was most vulnerable. The creature spoke again, and her soul trembled in fear, realizing it knew her on a deeper level. "You were chosen, Lucilla. We didn't want you to suffer, but you came to us on your own. You made your choice. The forest calls you. You are its child." And then something terrible happened. The forest seemed to come alive. The branches began to move, and the shadows around her fluttered, as though they were growing like living creatures, reaching out to her. Lucilla felt the ground beneath her tremble, and her eyes widened in fear. Everything around her was no longer just a forest. It was something alive, something watching her. It wasn't just a place. It was an entity that left her no choice. She turned, trying to understand where she was, and saw the tree canopies bending and moving toward her, as if the trees themselves were stretching their arms out. But in the darkness, there was another rustling, a relentless sound, like something slipping across the ground. The creature in the shadows stepped forward again. Lucilla tried to step back, but her body wouldn't obey. The forest filled her mind. Its smells, sounds, even its breath became hers. She was part of this place, part of this ancient power. The creature stood before her like a shadow of her past, like the ghost of her parents, who had now become part of this living nightmare. "You won't be able to leave, Lucilla," the voice in her head said, and she realized that it wasn't just words. It was ancient knowledge. It was a prophecy. You've always been here, and now you're with us. And the forest spoke again. The shadows thickened, and the air itself grew cold and oppressive. The creature took a step, and for a moment shadows flickered before her eyes, seeming alive. They were here, in her mind, in her soul. Lucilla knew. She could never return. The forest had become her home, and the creature, her shadow. When Lucilla finally came to her senses and tried to collect her thoughts, her mind returned to the conversation with the driver. His words, which had previously seemed like a simple statement of fact, now carried an ominous weight. He had said he was following James's orders. But with each passing moment, more unsettling images formed in her mind. The man who had driven her into this forest was not just a hired driver. He was part of something much larger. Like Lucilla, he was connected to this place, and perhaps even to her fate. She remembered his face, calm and almost expressionless, his eyes that showed no regret or sympathy when she screamed and begged for help. He had been indifferent, and when he said, "It's done," a feeling swept over her that he knew this wasn't just a trip. It was an inevitable part of some plan. He was a guide, but not in the way she'd imagined. He was a pawn in someone's game. And this game, as she now understood, was about her life. He was part of something much more sinister. But what made her remember James with such cold dread, a chill running down her spine as soon as she realized it? When she had last met his gaze, right before she found herself in this forest, there had been no surprise, no panic. His cold stare seemed to say, "I knew this was gonna." He hadn't been shocked by her disappearance. He knew it was meant to end this way. He was part of the plan. And now, her initial suspicion that he was involved in her tragedy had turned out to be more than just fear. It was a terrifying reality. Now she knew James wasn't just her fiancé. He was tied to this forest, to this cursed place, just like her parents. The thought coursed through her body, making her heart race. She realized she hadn't ended up here by accident. Her life had always been intertwined with this forest. James was a descendant of an ancient family that had kept a connection with this place for centuries. The forest was part of his lineage, and now he knew how to control its shadow, how to manipulate her fate, her blood, her family, her disappearance. All of it had been predestined, and now she couldn't escape. The forest seemed to already be part of her soul, her destiny. And James, he was not the person she had thought him to be. He was the one who had always known what awaited her here. And his calmness when they parted now seemed more horrific than any other betrayal. She pictured him, perhaps standing somewhere far away, watching her disappearance with a smile on his lips, knowing she wouldn't get out of here. He was so deeply tied to this place that maybe he was one of the people who had brought her into this forest. Maybe he was the one who had left her here, with the driver simply carrying out his orders, finishing what had already begun. He knew this moment was inevitable. He knew Lucilla was meant to become part of this game. But what was behind this curse? What was so important about bringing her here? Lucilla tried to remember everything she knew about her family, about her missing parents. Each glimpse of the creature in the forest, each step toward this relentless shadow, seemed to point to something more than just her fear. This wasn't just a vengeful curse or a coincidence. The forest was ancient, and its power merciless. She had already become part of this world, and her parents had probably been part of this game long before her. A clearer picture began to form in her mind. James was part of an ancient lineage that had struck a deal with the forest. This family controlled its powers, using its dark forces to govern life and death. Maybe her parents, like her now, had been part of this plan, victims, subjugated, or perhaps even its guardians. All these thoughts squeezed her chest, filling her mind with panic. But deep down, there was a greater unease, a realization that she had to accept her role in this ancient, bloody game. Lucilla walked through the dark forest, trying to understand what would happen to her now. With every step, the forest grew darker, and the shadows around her began to move, as if watching her every move. She clenched her teeth, feeling the terror seize her. But now her fear was mixed with determination. And if James was part of this world, part of the force that had drawn her here, she had to find a way to escape this nightmare. But how? She could feel his influence, his presence tightening around her. The forest had become her trap, and she couldn't even figure out what her only chance was, salvation or destruction. And now she stood at the decision that was probably her last. Should she run or should she accept her role? She was already part of this game. But if she stayed, what would she become? A victim or an extension of it? No matter how hard she tried to fight this horror, the understanding wouldn't let go. Everything she had known about herself had been a lie. With every step into the darkness of the forest, her past and future merged into something terrifying, where her fate was already written. And now, in the face of the inevitable, she had to find a way to take control, or become another part of this ancient, dreadful world. Lucilla stood frozen in place, staring at the horrifying creature before her. Its gaze, twisted with fear and pain, made her feel like she was a part of something far darker than just the forest or her own fate. This creature wasn't just a monster. It was the embodiment of all those who had failed to escape this forest. It was the dark shadow that consumed the lives and souls of anyone who had once stepped onto this land. And now it seemed she had become part of it. Her blood, her fears, her long-buried scars, everything about her seemed to merge with this creature. There was magic in her, a power binding her to this forest, to this shadow that devoured everything living. But she couldn't let it continue. She couldn't become a part of this nightmare. No, she wasn't a beast or a monster or a shadow. She was human, and it was that humanity that gave her strength, the strength to fight. The creature, despite its massive power and ominous nature, held no sway over her spirit. It tried to break her, to scare her, to turn her into its shadow. But Lucilla felt that she had a chance. She remembered the driver's words, his doubt, his sinister vigilance. When he had said he didn't understand why she was treated this way, his voice hadn't sounded like that of a subordinate. It sounded like someone who wasn't fully under the forest's control. That was a sign. Perhaps even he was part of this dark plan, but not entirely. That gave her hope. Standing before this creature, feeling its shadow enveloping her, her mind was clearer than ever before. She focused. The memory of how her parents had vanished in this forest, how they had become part of its shadow, gave her strength. She could feel them, their love, their pain. That was her power. That was the key that could break the curse. Lucilla shut her eyes and took a deep breath. She remembered the way her heart had raced with James when she felt his gaze on her. He was part of the same curse as this creature. His calmness when they parted, his certainty that things would end this way, all of it had seemed horribly predictable. She understood now that in his eyes, it wasn't just indifference. It was knowledge. Knowledge that she would end up here, facing this creature. That her fate had already been decided. But now, with every passing moment, her sense of despair and fear began to give way to resolve. If James was part of this plan, if he was connected to this forest, she had to break free. She had to be stronger. Because she wasn't just part of the forest, she was part of something bigger. Something she didn't fully understand yet. With every breath she felt the dark magic of the forest trying to engulf her, to bind her body and soul. But she was no longer afraid. All that remained was to find the strength within herself, to sever the connection and to free herself. She knew now that the forest wasn't just a place. It wasn't simply a territory filled with darkness. It was a living, breathing monster that fed on her fear, her pain, her betrayals. She raised her hand. The forest seemed to stir, as if it sensed her intentions. The creature before her couldn't help but notice how her energy was changing. Instead of fear, instead of doubt, Lucilla felt determination. She was ready to stand her ground. With each word, each movement of her will, she felt the magical bond to the forest weakening. The creature tried to move forward, but its movements slowed, as if it was losing strength. It was the moment when Lucilla realized, if she could destroy this connection, if she could break the cycle, she would free herself. The creature and the forest would be destroyed. This was her chance. She closed her eyes and began to speak words that seemed familiar, though she had never heard them before. These words were born in her mind, as if the earth itself were whispering them to her. She felt the magic of the forest starting to fade, its dark essence retreating, as if the very shadow was slipping from her body. The darkness of the forest began to dissipate. The creature before her vanished, merging with the shadow it had carried. The forest started to darken and disappear, swallowing everything that had been tied to this cursed place. The rustling of the trees, which had sounded so threatening, now quieted. The ground beneath Lucilla's feet became solid, lifeless, dead. The dark silhouettes of the trees faded, turning into empty, faceless forms, disappearing into the distant horizon. Lucilla stood alone, but now her soul was free. The forest was gone, its curses, its magic, its dark entities. Everything was gone. The creature was no longer part of her. Now, with everything silent, she understood. Her liberation wasn't the end, but a new beginning. She could be free. But the story didn't end there. James was still in her life, and she knew her fight wasn't over. He was part of what she had destroyed, and she would have to face him to understand why he was in this world, and what dark secrets his connection to this cursed forest held. But now Lucilla was ready. She had been freed, and now she was prepared to seek answers, and no one, no monster, no curse would stop her. When Lucilla returned to St. Louis, the city seemed just like it had been before she disappeared. But everything had changed for her. There was an eerie silence around her. Lucilla felt as though she was back among people. But the emptiness was impossible to ignore. She could see the people, their movements, but the world around her had become flat, colorless. Anxiety and unease never left her, not for a moment. Something was wrong, but she couldn't quite figure out what it was. James was gone, as if he had never existed. No traces, no memories. He had vanished into thin air, leaving only a vague recollection that quickly blurred, like a shadow dissolving in water. Lucilla tried to find any signs of his presence, but all her efforts were in vain. Even her elderly neighbor, who had once blessed her for the wedding, couldn't recall James or what had happened. She looked at Lucilla in confusion, unable to understand her distress. It wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. But Lucilla knew. The forest would never fully let her go. No matter how hard she tried to hide, no matter how much she tried to return to a normal life, it was all in vain. The forest and its monsters hadn't disappeared. They were in her blood, in her heart, in the darkest corners of her soul. The shadow of this place kept chasing her, even when she returned to the familiar world. The forest didn't release its grip. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel it. The forest was there, just beyond her consciousness, always present, in her thoughts, in her dreams. She saw it in nightmares, huge trees whose roots spread across her body, dark figures whispering her name. In its shadow, she felt her own soul slipping away, vanishing, becoming part of the forest. Her own body felt foreign, and she no longer knew where she ended and where the forest began. It was a bond that couldn't be broken. Her heart raced as she tried to focus on ordinary life, as though something were watching her. Every rustle, every movement in her field of vision made her tense up, as if her life were hanging by a thread again. Lucilla couldn't shake that feeling. And what was even stranger was that every time she looked at herself in the mirror, she noticed something new in her eyes. A look that didn't belong to her. A deep, dark, frightening gaze, like the creature she had faced in the forest. It was in her, and now it was watching her. No matter how hard Lucilla tried not to think about it, her life kept growing stranger. Every day, she felt the forest creeping into her thoughts, into her body, into her soul. And it seemed like she had no choice. She was part of it now, and she had become part of the horror that had once consumed her parents. That horror was now her life. One night, when she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she thought she heard a rustling, unnatural, as if something, or someone, was moving in the dark of her apartment. Her hands went cold, and her heart started pounding. She slowly turned her head, peering into the darkness. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But soon something appeared in the dark corner of the room, a shadow, moving unnaturally, as though it was hard to make out its true form. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was the shadow of the forest. It had come for her again. Lucilla jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, but suddenly a wall of shadow rose up before her. She felt her soul gripped by terror. The forest had returned, but now it was with her. It wasn't waiting, it was part of her, and its shadow was watching her, even in her own home. She stood in the hallway, unable to move, feeling the dark roots of this place starting to spread across her body, as if the forest itself wanted to pull her back to it. And in that moment, Lucilla realized there was no escape. The forest hadn't just filled her memory, it had filled her life. She could no longer tell where her reality ended and where the forest began. And at some point, she understood that the forest was her destiny. It was part of her, and now she was part of it. These thoughts tormented her. She tried to scream, but her voice was weak and powerless. The forest was consuming her. It wouldn't let go. She had already become part of it. And in that was her terror. The next few days became a true nightmare. Lucilla could no longer lead a normal life. Inside her, fear grew, as if she were living in someone else's body. Everything around her felt foreign. Every face, every glance became unreal. She searched for answers, trying to understand what had happened, but the more she tried to figure it out, the stronger her fear became. The forest was now part of her consciousness, part of her body, part of her soul. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know how to stop the process, how to take her life back. But one thing was clear. She couldn't escape. The forest would always be with her. And in the silence, in the emptiness left by her desperate flight from the forest, Lucilla realized the terrifying truth. The forest would never let her go.